All right, bud. Why don't you kick us off into tracking? The last T of the 5 T's.
Yeah, tracking is seeking to answer the question, how are we doing? Right. And so we started with target. And so we're kind of circling back with the idea of our target and asking the question, how are we doing? And we've talked about team and tools. So I'm thinking through with my target in mind, with those I'm teaming with, what is a tool that's super helpful in tracking? And one thing that's just been super helpful for me is just something called phases of engagement. And what we're thinking through on the phases of engagement is just tracking the progress among a segment. And so I'll just talk through those 7 briefly, but the first one is adoption. And so the adoption phase should take place while you're discerning the target or the segment that God is calling you to. And there's a couple of words I like to point out with this idea of adoption. One is you have a strategy, and 2, you have legitimate access to that segment. So it would be really easy for me to say my target is among the Uyghurs in China, but I don't have legitimate access to Uyghurs in China. So that wouldn't be actual adoption, but we're saying, hey, I have a strategy, I've taken ownership, and I have legitimate access. And so then as you move on, kind of the next step, even kind of following 4 fields a little bit, is I've got access, but then I need to be sharing the gospel. So that means as I'm tracking among a segment, we know that ourselves, our team, are workers sharing the gospel with this people with the intention of church planting. And then phase 3 is, okay, now I've got reports that there's believers responding to the gospel with repentance and faith. And it's not just one, but multiple people, and they're showing obedience through baptism. So it's not just I knocked on the door, some lady said yes, but we're seeing multiple people showing actual movement to Christ through repentance and faith and baptism. And then as that happens, we want to begin to gather those people. And so then we're tracking, hey, is there a local church that has indigenous leaders emerging? So it may be an outsider who's helping organize and facilitate, but we see indigenous leaders emerging. Then reproducing churches. So we have indigenous leaders, and we're seeing second generations of groups and churches started. Churches multiplying. There's leaders multiplying, there's churches multiplying to the 4th generation, authorities free and open generation to generation. And we're at this point that we're seeing what's really defined as a movement, multiple streams of 4th generation. Phase 7 is, hey, there is a large percentage of the population who are following Christ, worshiping in churches in their language with their people. And then even you're seeing multiple church planting networks spread out among that segment. So the 7 phases is really helpful in tracking. So when I think of tracking, that's often what I think about, but there's lots of other things that we track. What's some other things that you guys track?
Training is something that we track. So where are we training? What are we training? And how are we developing leaders? And one common tool that people use for that is a mall map. So as we're modeling, model assist, and watching and launching folks, how are we tracking their progress? What is their confidence? What is their competence? And where are they in their leadership development? So that's one simple tracking tool that we use.
Yeah, just a general statement. I mean, if you can show me what you track, I can show you what you care about. I mean, anything that we track is what we care about. Tracking takes work, it takes some focus, but we know it's vital, and it has to be connected with our vision. And so also in the absence of a vision statement, a good tracking system, I could reflect back to you what your vision is based on what you track, in other words. So with that in mind, as we think about our vision, I mean, the things that I think of to track would be things like, field activity reporting, just general engagement of an unengaged people group. what did you experience? What did you learn in the harvest? And, did you find a believer among that group? And then what did you do with them? Did you follow up with some training on how they could share the gospel with their oikos? And good field activity reporting, and there's different categories of it. Some might just be a verification of their location, which is helpful, but it's not probably the highest, most valuable field activity report. I mean, it's good to know where they are, obviously, but then we might run into another person who's also targeting them with a full strategy. Well, that's unique and that's good. We could follow up on that through collaborating and networking. So there's different levels of field activity reporting. That's one kind of tracking. I think also just telling the story. A lot of people say, well, I don't like to track. I'm like, well, do you like to give testimony to what you're seeing God do in the harvest? It's like, well, yes. I'm like, well, you're kind of tracking. I mean, you're telling the story. You're reflecting on what you're seeing God do. Another thing, as Kyle said, would be training. We recognize that training has a part to play in an overall strategy. So we'll track that, and also just generational mapping with health as a motive to keep up with, are these disciples in churches healthy? So do we have a way to objectively look at that? And like I said, it takes some work. And I think around this topic of tracking, there's a lot of, I've noticed some pushback on this. And I think that comes from a number of different reasons. If I could go there for a moment, I think one is just not really understanding why we do it. Why is it important? How does it actually make us better? And I think that's an important part of the conversation. If I'm going to do an iron on iron with somebody, and that person can't reflect back to me what their field impact has been, it's hard for me to have any input. I mean, they've got to be able to reflect that back. So that's really important. So there are some reasons for resistance to tracking that just need to be addressed through conversation, but we can't just avoid it altogether. I mean, no one who accomplishes anything can do that. If you want to be a better athlete, you're going to keep up with your stats. Am I hitting more balls or hitting fewer balls? And if I'm not hitting those balls, in a baseball analogy, we need to probably switch up the coaching a little bit. We're not training correctly, so there's a few thoughts there.
Yeah, a couple things I would add that for me personally, it's been really helpful is like whenever I think of the phases of engagement, so like adoption, gospel, believers, church, tracking fewer things, but things that are applicable to the phase among the segment. And so like if I am in the adoption phase, that means I have a strategy, but I don't really have access yet because I don't know where these people are. Then I just want to track how many people am I meeting. Like a very simple thing to track would be for people's first names among that segment. It's like we've said this before, but that's something very early on that's very measurable, because I can't expect to get to the next phase without knowing people among that segment. And so then it's like, okay, now once I have legitimate access and I have a strategy, then I want to count gospel shares. Like at that point, I'm not counting number of churches because they don't exist. But it's like, I'm still going after first names. I'm still counting gospel shares. I may be counting people who I've trained to share the gospel. So it's like how many laborers are sharing the gospel, but it's very specific to the phase of engagement among that segment. But once I get to reproducing churches, man, I may not be counting gospel shares anymore, but I'm looking at church health. I'm looking at generation maps. I'm looking at number of leaders that are developing leaders. So the tracking totally shifts. And if I'm in phase 6 and I'm still counting people's first names and gospel shares, I'm probably micromanaging. But if I'm over here in gospel and I'm trying to draw a gen map, it's like I don't know what I'm being, but it's like I'm wasting my time, right? So just even understanding there's certain phases of different means of tracking, and there's 2 types of tracking. There's controllables and uncontrollables. and understanding that I have no control over controllables. Another way of thinking of it is input and output, or a lead measure or lag measure. It's like, based off the word of God and spirit of God, I believe these things I should be doing, one, as a faithful disciple, but two, that it leads to these things that I can't control. Like, God is in control of that. And so we can set goals for controllable. So like, hey, for my team or not my network, we want to share the gospel 100 times this week. But I can just look at what God's done as far as number of new believers. So in the gospel phase, like, I can set a gospel sharing goal, and then I just want to track what God is doing. And tracking what God is doing, one, we celebrate, but two, let's say I've been doing this for 6 months now and we've only seen 4 believers. It's like, okay, maybe it comes a problem solving conversation to say, maybe our tool needs to be tweaked if we bring it back to tools. And then I personally make the tweak and I see an uptick, and it's like, it's not that God was doing it differently. It's like, maybe our gospel tool just wasn't clear to this people and they just couldn't understand what I was saying. And so it helps too in problem solving, troubleshooting. Dave, you look like you got a good story to go along with that.
What, you mean being the guy that's always pushing back on tracking because I'm terrible at it?
Yes.
I'll just say this. I spent time in the first church that we started to apply the principles that we were trained in the No Place Left network back in 2015. And we got on board with, man, we got to abundantly seed sow. And so we were basically in that. We didn't have the phases, but I would put us in. We had a church and we knew that we wanted to sow the seed broadly, and we didn't have a target. We didn't have anything specific. So we were just going after the people that were right around us in our neighborhoods. And so we started to set a goal for gospel shares each week. And we kind of understood the principle that together we could share more than we could as an individual. And so we started just very diligently saying, we want 50 gospel shares this week. And I watched this group of believers. There was only about 12 of us, and 5 of them were my children. So that gives you an idea. There were 12, and 7 of them was my family, my wife and my children, right? But I watched this group of 5 adults and a handful of children start to share the gospel 60 plus times a week. And we went for like 2 months where, without exaggerating, we had over 600 gospel shares from this little bitty group of people. We had to make some tweaks, and the tracking started to take on a form that was unhealthy for us in terms of how focused we are on just sharing the gospel, because it had its disadvantages as well, which we could talk about. But just that simple little act of coming in and on the Sundays celebrating how many times the gospel was shared together as a group made all the difference in the world in our group, going from being, I don't know if I have anybody I can share the gospel with, to, man, look how many times we can share the gospel with together. It was incredible. It was like an incredible season. And I will say that where we are now in Oklahoma City, the vast majority of the work that we're still working through and the connections that we made and the network that was created out of that couple of 3 months is something that we're still seeing the fruit of in Oklahoma City, in terms of leaders, in terms of churches, in terms of connections, in terms of training. And so that one particular instance was, for us, just crucial to really getting over the hump.
I think that's one of the secrets of tracking, is how do we use this to keep people encouraged and to build faith into those that are laboring? And how do we use this not only to answer that question, how are we doing? How do we use it to help people see that, man, God is really using us. God is really working through our efforts, and not, man, these people just want these numbers to report to some agency or for some, fleshly reason. Tracking is important. We see it in the Bible, right? And
there's a whole book about numbers.
There is. It's in Nehemiah, right? I do have a tracking problem, like you, Dave. It's really difficult for me because I'm so focused and head down on the work. But I've seen in my own experience that has actually hindered my progress because I wasn't asking that question. Well, how are we doing? We're doing a lot of things, but are we doing the right things in the right places at the right time? And I really don't know unless I'm tracking. So how do we use tracking effectively to help people keep encouraged, keep faith up, help people see that God really is using us? And how do we help people use tracking to, I would say you have to track or you'll get lost. How do we not get lost in the work? Because there's so much work, there's so much activity, there's so much thrust towards seeing what we want to see. But if we're not tracking, we might get lost.
I like that. And I would even say that, we've had people come onto our team for seasons, maybe even very short seasons, like a few weeks. And when we pay attention to their field at impact, the reality is, do we believe that these could be the footnotes for the redemptive history of that group that we could later look back on and see the small little contributions that all came together to see this group reached? And going back to what Bub was saying, also the phases of engagement, if someone claims, they believe that their people group is at a certain place in the phases of engagement, I think it's legitimate to be able to say, can you show me some evidence for that? What leads you to choose that number within the 7 or some odd phases of engagement? And I think it's valid to be able to say, well, yeah, let me show you this generational church map, or let me show you this or that. And but no, I agree with Kyle completely. We have to be really careful, and it goes back to another thing Bud said about the controllables and the non-controllables. We definitely celebrate the non-controllables, those things that God does. We love those things, but we acknowledge that He did that. But along that pathway toward that, celebrating the controllables to say, hey, you know what? Praise God. We're getting the gospel out, this 50, 60 times a week or whatever it may be. And we can celebrate that also, but definitely use it as a source of encouragement. And I think that's a current concern. People are afraid they're going to become discouraged. And so it definitely takes some skill and good motivation for this, but it is very important for us to be able to self-evaluate. Is what we're doing effective, and do we need to make any adjustments?
I think for me, just to jump in on that question, Kyle, when we detach vision from tracking, we shoot ourselves in the foot. And what I mean by that is, if I'm not telling the story constantly about what we're about and reminding people where we're going and what God's called us to and what really motivated us in the first place to even do what we're doing, then that vision bucket gets low, right? It drips, it leaks. And we've got to constantly fill up the vision bucket in order for people to not get discouraged. Because in my own particular life, there was nothing worse than being a student going to school and sitting in math class and getting a grade for something that I had no idea why it mattered. That used to just drive me insane, right? So my sister, God bless her, she'll never listen to this podcast because she, probably has a brain. I'm just kidding. She'd be like, it's my little brother just talking. I had to deal with that my whole life. But she's a math teacher. I love her. But every single time my kids have a math question, I call her, because all throughout school, just to be honest, when I would get a bad grade or something in math, I go, but I know how to do it. I know how to do it. What difference does it make if I, do the homework? All right. Unfortunately, I raised my kids and they all have my same attitude because my children are like their father. But it goes back to that simple question of, if people don't know why we're tracking and what it is we're after, then tracking just becomes super discouraging. And it's very discouraging to me. But if we come back and we're saying, okay, this is something that's way bigger than us. Like there's no one of us that can do this. And when we say, now let us know what you're doing, not so we can say who's better or who's worse, but we can say together, this is what we're all doing. It's amazing how, in my example, you have an adult who said, man, I only shared the gospel 3 times this week. Somebody else goes, well, I shared the gospel 7 or 8 times this week. As we spread it all out, we're going, wow, we didn't really realize we could share the gospel this much without us all thinking we have to do it like 30 times this week to make any difference. But together, right, as a group, we never imagined we could share the gospel this much. And when it was connected to the vision, then everybody got to celebrate the contributions, right? Everybody got to be like, whoa, like I didn't think we could do this. And it was a we conversation. Where the breakdown happened for us was it lost its vision and it started to turn into, did you meet your goal or not? And when you start trying to motivate people with a spreadsheet or motivate people with a tracking, you've already lost the battle, because tracking can't motivate. Tracking can encourage, tracking can spur on. But if you were left to, are you doing the job that we said we were going to do as the motivation, then you've already lost what it is that drives the tracking. But when tracking has the way of saying what we all want to do, look at what's happening and we can celebrate together, then it just has an incredible motivating impact on what everybody is doing. I just think that vision piece, if that makes sense, is so important, that tracking has to be connected to the vision that people are bought into, because it allows us to go, we're getting there together.
Great. Can I give just maybe like a case study I'm in the middle of? So I do some consulting for an apartment ministry group. And so they define their vision as every staff and resident to have the opportunity to hear the gospel, become a disciple of Jesus, and learn how to multiply disciples. So that's their vision. And so we tracked the engagement last year, saw thousands and thousands and thousands of gospel shares, saw hundreds of professions of faith, and only about a dozen baptisms. And so when you look at that, you say they're really bought in on the front side of that vision. And so in problem solving, this is kind of where I landed, is it's a little bit of ecclesiology, I think, the problem. And so really what we're doing now is we're pressing for church planting in these apartment complexes, because some of the pushback we got when we started asking questions about why are so few people getting baptized when literally hundreds of people are making professions of faith. And not only that, there are over 100 people in Bible studies who's come to faith. What's the issue? And they're like, well, my church background, like baptism is part of church. And so rather than fighting the ecclesiology conversation as far as what is the role and function, we just said, we just think it's healthy to plant churches. And so now we're starting to cast vision for church planting, and then we're going to start counting that. But that's an example, like if we were not tracking, we would not even know that problem existed. And we would have, disjointed disciples, disobedient disciples, or incomplete discipleship, like however you like, it's a gap. And without tracking, we wouldn't have seen that. And so then we're able to problem solve it and say, okay, for the next 6 months, this is what we're going to do to try to see some correction. And like, it could work, it could not work. We don't know. We're just in the middle of trying it, but it wouldn't even be on our radar if we weren't tracking.
That's a great example. Do you guys have any last thoughts on tracking y'all wanted to toss out there?
I think not get hung up on being crazy precise on especially like numbers of things. I mean, in terms of moving the needle on lostness, I think that's really what we want to see. That's a better image, I think. No one wants to be a bean counter or put notches on anything, but are we actually seeing a trend of more gospel sharing? And maybe that's helpful, can take some of the edge off. I do think another comment would be, In a team environment, I wouldn't put, I don't think anyone was suggesting this, but people's individual lead or lag indicators, but it's a team. It's kind of a collective thing as a team, especially as you're trying to get people to buy into tracking. You've got to reflect it back to your team or your community in a way that adds value, to see if the needle's moving, to see if we're seeing an increase in gospel shares or baptisms or whatever that might be, or even training, if that's your goal, to train more, if that's the direction you're going in. And maybe just acknowledge, just say, hey, this is where we're going side by side. This is how the trend's going, and we only have around half of us reporting currently. Yes, and I know that may sound, and those half will know who they are, and they might actually say, wow, I've actually done quite a bit compared to the overall total. If my numbers were in there, everyone would be even more encouraged. And so just something to consider as you're trying to, as a team leader, don't get impatient or aggravated. But I think when people see that you're going to reflect it back to them, it might click why this is actually important. And especially as the discussion centers around some of the tracking, they'll see the implications of that, and it'll make more sense to them why this is important.
Hey, Kyle, tie a bow on it. Give us a rundown again of the 5 T's and just some thoughts that you've had even from this conversation. I'm over here every now and then I'm like looking down at the edge of the table. I'm over here writing down even more things that I'm learning as you guys are talking, right? So what are some highlights for you that have come out of this conversation that you hope to see? And then remind us again, like next steps. What can somebody do if they're listening to this? Where are we headed in the United States? You talked a little bit about in the first podcast of this series, kind of what we were after. But does that make sense? Where can somebody go? What can they do? What are some lessons that you've pulled out even of this conversation?
Man, I think just the framework of the 5 T's has been so helpful. I've talked about this on a number of occasions. And just seeing them as categories to hang thoughts on as you're beginning to look at something so complex. And you don't have to understand all the facets of the 5 T's to really start using them as a framework to help you get to local ownership of the core missionary task, the vision that you're pursuing. And so it's been a learning process for me. I'm continuing to learn. We're all continuing to learn. We're breaking new territory still in the United States and North America, Canada, among complex UPG targets. So I think just having this framework has been extremely helpful. It's been a breakthrough in thinking and moving towards what we want to see. I am incredibly thankful for the community of practitioners that are on this call, and then all of those in North America that are pursuing the same things together. And we just continue to learn and try to stay humble and continue to put our hands to the plow. And we need each other. We need encouragement because we're doing hard work. And I think that the posture of a strategy coordinator is something that we hit on a lot of times. And Dave, I think the analogy that you use is that guy laying on the barbed wire and letting everybody else run over you. And that's not a fun place to be, but somebody's got to do it. And, as we talk about thousands of strategy coordinators, that's thousands of people laying their life down so people can run over them to see the mission accomplished. And, what else do you want to give your life to, right? What else would you want to give your life to than seeing the Great Commission accomplished in your lifetime, or giving a contribution towards that? So I love this conversation. I'm loving that we get to have it together, and I'm loving being around extremely smart and talented people like you guys and all those that have contributed to it. So,
well, by no means do we represent the totality of the conversation. I mean, we're standing upon
Nope.
the backs of those guys who already laid down on the wires well before we ever got there.
Absolutely.
The number of men and women that we are standing on the shoulders of is absolutely incredible. But I just want to thank you guys, Kyle, Pierson, Will Smith, Bud Houston. You guys are gifts to what the Lord is doing to his church. I know that he's called you and he's entrusted you with a very important work. And I'm just thankful that you're faithful to do exactly what he's gifted the church with. Because, whenever I read Ephesians chapter 4, I see those roles, those 5 giftings as gifts to the church. In other words, he's plucking us out and he's saying, you're given to them. And the work that you're doing, the way you're contributing is super helpful. I know that Mark and I will continue as we go on this podcast to let any of our listeners know when a training is coming up. There's going to be some strategy coordinator trainings using the 5T framework. They're going to be rolled out around the United States to come. There's a handful that are already scheduled. When those are firmed up, we'll definitely let you guys know that are listening in and watching, so that you can make a decision, if possible, for you to come and be a part of one of those bucket trainings, and then maybe get rolled into a cohort where we can drip this out a little bit at a time, and we can help coach you and learn alongside with you about what it's doing. If you got any questions about looking for calling, or this is just scratching a need, Mark and I have already talked to a couple of gentlemen who've just listened into some of the conversations, and they said, man, this is exactly where I am, exactly what I need. We have a feeling that God is calling thousands and thousands, as Kyle said, and you guys just may not know that this is what God's called you to. But when you hear this, something in your soul goes, that's what I'm looking for. By all means, reach out, and we'll get you connected to as anybody we can in our network to get you move forward. Bud, Will, is there any last thoughts that you guys have as we kind of wrap up this series of what it looks like to train strategy coordinators with the 5 Ts?
Well, I just tell you what, it's been a great honor to be here in the United States and to serve in this network of No Place Left. I love this family, and it's a huge honor to serve in this way. And that's just really all I've got to say. It's just thank you for inviting me to be a part of this call, Dave.
Yeah, I would just say to those who are listening, who are in the North America context, that they really feel like at one point in time that the Lord was stirring their heart for the nations. Where God has you is on purpose and for a purpose. This isn't second place. This is a strategic role in the mission of God, because God will use you to mobilize a team, Bangladeshi Muslim background believers back to Bangladesh, and Arab believers back to the Arab world. God is using you. And just continue to abide in him and hear his voice and obey his calling.